The galaxy had forgotten Commander Jacob Voss, if not for the hushed legends whispered in the darkest corners of space. Once, his name was spoken with awe, a leader who brought entire fleets of enemies to their knees. His strategies were genius, his ability to command flawless, and his reputation for ruthless efficiency spread across countless star systems. He was the hero humanity had rallied behind in its most desperate hours. But that was before the betrayal. Voss's disappearance shattered humanity's morale. The moment the coalition of alien races, led by the ruthless Zorlath Empire, delivered their crushing blow, the commander vanished. No body was found, and no sign of him emerged. It was as if the galaxy had swallowed him whole. A few scattered survivors claimed to have seen his ship, the Vanguard, drifting in the void, its systems powered down, but they were dismissed as broken souls clinging to false hope. Humanity's finest warrior was gone, and the war seemed lost with him. Years passed, and the galaxy suffered. The Zorlath Empire's grip tightened, their forces spread like a shadow across countless planets. No one dared defy them, not even the once proud human resistance. The alliance fractured under the weight of its failures. Planet after planet fell, their people either assimilated into the alien collective or erased from existence. The human species had become a relic, forgotten by most, and dismissed as weak. And yet, whispers began. First, it was just rumors. A mysterious figure seen on the fringes of war zones, a lone ship emerging from the darkness, striking at alien convoys with the precision of an ancient predator. The reports were inconsistent, sometimes true, sometimes exaggerated, but they shared one thing in common: the name that followed every encounter: Jacob Voss. The legends were resurfacing, and a group of survivors, once part of the Alliance's most elite forces, came together in secret. In a forgotten outpost on the edges of known space, they gathered, their faces hard, their eyes filled with the same desperation that had once fueled their cause. The Alliance was no more, and the last remnants of humanity hung on by a thread. They knew they needed a miracle, and that miracle had a name: Voss. Captain Alia Rowe, leader of this group, had led her squad through some of the worst battles of the war. Her face, scarred by years of conflict, was a silent testament to her survival. She stood before a holoscreen, which flickered with the image of an ancient human ship, a relic of a past long buried. It was the Vanguard, or at least, what was left of it. "This is our last chance," Rowe said, her voice low but resolute. "We're all that's left. No more second chances." Her team, veterans who had lost everything, nodded in grim agreement. They had nothing but the hope of finding the Warlord, the only human who could possibly turn the tide. The message they would send would be simple, yet profound. "We need you, Commander Voss. Humanity needs you." The message would reach the farthest corners of the galaxy, where even the most unlikely of ears might hear it. They didn't know if it would be enough to pull the forgotten Warlord from the shadows, but they were willing to risk everything. The galaxy was dying, and only one human commander, one leader, held the key to saving it. The Vanguard had been silent for years, but Rowe couldn't help but wonder, could the ghost of the Warlord still be out there? Was Voss watching, waiting, or had he truly been lost to the stars? She prayed the legend was more than myth. Humanity's last hope rested on the impossible. Jacob Voss had buried his past deep in the windswept deserts of a forgotten world, a planet devoid of life except for the unyielding dust that seemed to embody the weight of his regrets. The commander's exile wasn't a retreat, but a slow, steady erosion of his soul. For years, he had lived in silence, the endless battles of the galaxy fading into a distant memory. But the pain of betrayal, an old wound that refused to heal, kept him awake in the dark hours of the night. The betrayal had come from within. His closest friend, General Nathaniel Zarek, had turned on him when the war's tide had shifted. When the Zorlath Empire breached the heart of the human defense, Voss had led his fleet to a victory that seemed to guarantee humanity's survival. But Zarek, a man who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with Voss, had secretly struck a deal with the enemy. His treachery left the human forces in chaos, with Voss alone to bear the burden of a lost war, and worse, the loss of his entire command. Voss had barely escaped with his life that day, but the scars Zarek had left on him, on his heart, on his trust, had never faded. He had sworn an oath to never raise his weapon again, to never again lead humanity into the depths of war. Yet now, in the silence of his exile, he couldn't escape the echoes of that promise. He had abandoned his duty. He had abandoned them all. Then came the call. A voice, gravelly, desperate, and unbroken, pulled him from the abyss of his self-imposed isolation. It was a message from the remnants of humanity, desperate for a miracle, and speaking his name, Voss. At first, he thought it was another desperate plea from a shattered people, another doomed attempt to revive the memory of a legend long faded. But as the message played, his heart skipped a beat, a flicker of something long forgotten. Hope. The voice at the other end spoke of Zarek, now a high-ranking general in the alien empire. It wasn't enough for Zarek to have sold out humanity. He had taken control of its enemy, becoming their most brutal weapon, waging war against his own kind. The remnants of humanity had survived the fall, but they were barely holding on. With Zarek's power, the humans stood no chance. Only Voss, the last hope of a once mighty force, could turn the tide. The words cut deeper than any wound. Zarek had become the very thing Voss hated, a weapon of destruction, a shadow of his old self. And yet, there was something more. It wasn't just vengeance that burned inside Voss. It was the call of humanity, the call of a people who had been abandoned, left to die while their greatest warrior retreated from the battle. His heart, long hardened, began to thaw. Perhaps it was time to face the man who had betrayed him, to face the ghosts of his past, and to honor the oath he had once made to his people. With his resolve forming like the distant thunder of a coming storm, Voss knew what he had to do. The stars above had not forgotten him. The universe had its way of calling those who had once stood as giants to rise once again. For the first time in years, the commander's hands wrapped around the hilt of his weapon, and he felt the familiar weight of it, familiar, but colder now, tempered with the burden of his past. He stood from the worn chair where he'd spent so many years of quiet reflection, staring at the desolate horizon. A single thought burned in his mind. If humanity is to survive, I must return. The past could not be undone, but the future was still unwritten. With a single command to the long-dormant vanguard, he began to prepare for the journey. The Warlord was coming back, and vengeance would be his. The galaxy would soon learn that the forgotten Warlord was not done. No, he was far from it. The vanguard was a relic, its hull pitted with battle scars and decades of neglect. Once a symbol of human might, it now felt like a ghost ship, its systems sputtering to life as Voss's hands moved across the console. The old warship was powered by little more than scraps and salvaged parts. It had seen better days, but it had one thing that no alien fleet could match: the undying will of its commander. Voss had always been a tactician, a leader who knew how to inspire loyalty, even in the most desperate of times. But now, as he stared at the dim screens of the vanguard, he knew that he wasn't leading a fleet of elite soldiers anymore. He was leading a motley crew of broken veterans, outcasts, and survivors. His old ways, the commanding voice that had once rallied thousands, felt foreign now, lost in the silence of this forgotten corner of the galaxy. Captain Alia Rose stood at the ship's bridge, her face unreadable as she watched Voss prepare for the mission ahead. Her team had joined him in this endeavor, but every one of them carried scars, both physical and emotional. The war had taken its toll on all of them, and trust had become a currency more precious than any precious metal. In their eyes, Voss wasn't the commander they remembered. He was a ghost. And ghosts had no place leading the living. "I don't know if this is madness or brilliance," Rose said, her voice cutting through the tension. We're not just fighting a war. We're facing an empire. And we're doing it with a ship that shouldn't even be in the air." Voss turned to her, his expression cold but steady. "You asked for the last chance. You got it." His eyes flickered over the faces of his crew, all of them silent, all of them waiting for his next order. "I don't need you to believe in me. I need you to believe in the mission." Crow wasn't sure if she was reassured or even more unsettled. The man she once admired, who had once led armies with fire and passion, was now a shadow of the commander he had been. But she knew better than to argue. The Vanguard was their only hope. The galaxy was on the brink, and if they didn't succeed, humanity would be wiped out for good. The crew, each broken in their own ways, reluctantly fell into formation, knowing this was their only shot. They gathered in the war room, a stark contrast to the battle-hardened war councils they had once attended. Here, the light was dim, the walls cold, and the air filled with the weight of failure and regret. Still, there was something else in the room, a fire that had been lit, if only faintly. Voss outlined his plan. The Zorlath Empire had spread itself too thin. Its fleets were vast, but they were not invincible. The Vanguard's primary objective would be a surprise strike at one of their most critical supply lines, a vulnerable point in the Empire's extensive network. It wasn't much, but it was a chance, a spark that could ignite the rebellion. They would hit fast, hit hard, and disappear before the enemy even knew what happened. "I've fought against the Zorlath before," Voss continued, his voice growing steadier. "They don't know humanity the way we do. They think they've beaten us, but they've forgotten something important. They've forgotten what makes us human." Ro and the rest of the crew listened, feeling the faintest glimmer of the old fire in Voss's words. His reputation was legendary. He had outsmarted, outlasted, and outfought alien invaders who had never even considered the possibility of defeat. But the question now was, could he still do it? Could the ghosts of his past, his betrayals, his broken promises, be enough to bring them all to victory? The Vanguard lurched into hyperspace, a battered ship with a battered crew, setting a course for the heart of the enemy's domain. As the stars blurred into the void, a new tension gripped the ship, not the uncertainty of the mission ahead, but the growing realization that this was their last shot. There was no turning back. For Voss, for Ro, and for every soul aboard, this was not just a mission. It was the fight for the very survival of humanity. As the ship cut through the blackness, Voss stood at the helm, his hands gripping the console. The past, the betrayal, the years of silence, all of it seemed to melt away. There was only one thing left to do, and that was to make the universe remember. The Warlord had returned. The Vanguard drifted into the shadows of Zorlath-controlled space like a phantom, barely detectable against the vastness of the cosmos. The crew was tense, knowing that any misstep could be their last. Commander Voss's plan had been simple: strike quickly, strike hard. But in the enemy's territory, simplicity was a luxury they couldn't afford. Every maneuver, every decision would be critical. There was no room for error. As the ship entered the Zorlath supply corridor, Aelia Rose studied the sensor readouts, her fingers flying over the console. The galaxy had once been a playground of technological marvels, but now, every sensor ping felt like a ticking clock, a countdown to a fight they might not survive. "Status." Voss's voice came from behind her, sharp as ever, but lacking the fire it once had. 2 Zorlath cruisers ahead, patrolling the supply line. A few smaller ships nearby. "We're close enough to strike, but they'll spot us the moment we make a move," Ro reported, her eyes flicking between the readings. "We'll need a distraction." Voss didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared at the vastness of the space outside the ship's viewport. A dark, endless expanse that had swallowed up so much already. So many lives, so many hopes. His mind, still haunted by the betrayal, began to drift. But then, with a slow exhale, he snapped back to the present. "The distraction," Voss said, his voice hardening, "will come from us." With an experienced hand, He turned toward the crew gathered in the war room. Their faces, once filled with skepticism, were now somber. They knew the risks, but there was something else now. A resolve, forged by the fire of shared struggle. It wasn't just a mission, it was personal. Voss's fingers brushed over the battle plans, pulling up a series of trajectories and combat strategies. We'll hit them from two fronts. Ro, you take the smaller vessels. The rest of us will engage the cruisers head-on. We'll create chaos, confuse their sensors, and disappear into the blackness before they know what hit them. Ro gave him a questioning look. Head-on. Are you sure that's the best way? Voss met her gaze, the old fire now rekindled, however faintly. There's no time for hesitation. If we want to survive, we have to make them react, not think. The Zorlath rely on their superior numbers and firepower, but they're slow to adapt. They think we're weak. We're going to remind them just how dangerous we can be. The crew exchanged wary glances, but didn't argue. The plan was audacious, suicidal even, but Voss's word was law now. They had no choice but to follow him into the fire. As they approached the first cruiser, Voss and his team took their positions. The Vanguard's hull trembled slightly as they slid into position. The hum of the ship's failing systems, a constant reminder of how precarious this operation was. Alia's team prepped the smaller fighters, gearing up for their distraction mission. The tension on the ship was palpable, but everyone knew this was the moment. This was the test of whether Voss's plan, and his leadership, could actually pull them through. 5 seconds to entry. Ro's voice echoed through the comms. Ready to drop in. Do it, Voss ordered, his face impassive. The ship jolted as the cloaking device activated, and in an instant, they dropped out of hyperspace, right into the teeth of the enemy. The Zorlath cruisers, too slow to react, were caught off guard. Voss's crew unleashed their attack, laser cannons raking across the hull of the nearest cruiser, the sound of explosions shaking the Vanguard as they tore into the enemy's armor. Captain, we've got incoming fighters, one of the crew shouted as smaller Zorlath ships swarmed in, responding to the assault. Ro's pilots broke formation to engage, her voice calm but commanding through the comms. Stay sharp, keep them off us. Don't let them regroup. The Vanguard was a sitting target, but Voss's gamble was paying off. The chaos they created was more than just an attack, it was a smokescreen. The Zorlath were now chasing shadows, trying to respond to too many threats at once. Voss knew they wouldn't have long before the enemy adapted, but for now, they had the upper hand. In the heart of the battle, Voss's mind shifted from strategy to survival. His old instincts, honed in countless campaigns, kicked in as if he had never left the battlefield. Every movement was deliberate, every shot calculated. He could hear the war cries of his crew, the intensity of the battle resonating in the walls of the Vanguard. They were alive. They were fighting. And it was working. The Zorlath cruisers were reeling, their formations in disarray, but they were far from defeated. They had underestimated the human commander, and now they were paying the price. Status. Voss called out, his eyes scanning the tactical display. The battle was far from over. We've breached the first cruiser's defenses, Ro replied, a note of satisfaction in her voice. But more ships are coming in. We've bought ourselves some time, but not much. Voss's gaze hardened. We'll take what we can get. As the Vanguard danced between the enemy ships, evading fire and retaliating with deadly precision, one thing became clear. The Warlord had returned, and the galaxy would remember his name once more. The Vanguard shuddered with each impact as enemy fire rained down, the aging ship creaking under the strain. Yet Voss remained unshaken, his mind a razor-sharp focus amidst the chaos. The Zorlath cruisers, though powerful, were floundering in the wake of the sudden assault. They were used to overwhelming their enemies with sheer numbers and firepower, but they hadn't anticipated a human commander who could outthink them at every turn. Captain Ro, status on the smaller vessels. Voss called, his voice cutting through the sounds of the battle. "We've taken down 2 of their fighters," Ro responded over the comms. "But they keep coming. We'll need reinforcements soon, or they'll wear us down." Voss glanced at the tactical map, his eyes flicking over the rapidly changing battlefield. The Vanguard had dealt a significant blow to one of the cruisers, but it was far from enough. The Zorlath had already begun to regroup, and more ships were entering the fray from the rear. Time was running out. "We don't have reinforcements," Voss muttered to himself. His team was spread thin, their resources limited. But then an idea sparked. An old trick, one that had served him well in countless battles. He turned sharply to his weapons officer. "Fire at their engines. Disable their pursuit." The officer's brow furrowed. "Are you sure? It'll draw all their attention to us." "It's the only way to get their focus off Ro's team," Voss snapped. "Do it now." The Vanguard's cannons opened fire once again, a precise barrage aimed at the vulnerable engine sections of the nearest Zorlath cruiser. The first few shots missed, but then the targeting system locked onto the ship's weak point. The next volley struck home, rupturing the ship's engines and sending a shockwave of explosions rippling across its hull. The Zorlath cruiser flared in a bright fiery bloom as its engines blew out, sending it spinning into the void. The remaining ships in the fleet hesitated, momentarily stunned by the loss of one of their most powerful vessels. It was enough of a delay for Ro's fighters to break free and regroup with the Vanguard, the incoming fire starting to dissipate as the Zorlath were forced to reorganize. "We've created an opening," Voss said, his voice cold with determination. "Now we take the rest down." He turned back to the helm, his eyes scanning the tactical readout. The Zorlath had regrouped, but their response was delayed just long enough. The Vanguard was now in a prime position to strike, and Voss wasn't going to waste it. "Prepare for another pass," he ordered. "We're not leaving until this battle is won." The crew sprang into action, locking down their positions and powering up the weapon systems for another strike. Ro's squadron, now fully reformed, moved into formation, ready for the next phase of the assault. As the Vanguard made its final approach, Voss reflected on the strange sense of déjà vu that had settled over him. It had been years since he commanded a fleet, let alone led an assault of this magnitude. But every decision, every movement felt as familiar as breathing. The weight of his past, the betrayals, the losses, was still there, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. But right now, it didn't matter. The galaxy needed him, and for the first time in a long while, he needed the galaxy. 3 ships remaining, Ro reported, her voice crackling with intensity. "We've got them cornered." "Not cornered," Voss corrected her, his lips curling into a thin smile. "We've got them exactly where we want them." The Vanguard surged forward, its weapons unleashed in a deadly flurry of energy. The remaining Zorlath ships attempted to scatter, but it was too late. The Vanguard's cannons, now firing with the full fury of the old Warlord's precision, tore into their ranks, one by one. The first ship disintegrated in a brilliant explosion. The second, unable to avoid the oncoming assault, suffered massive damage, its hull breaking apart under the weight of the Vanguard's relentless bombardment. The last cruiser, now the only ship left in the battle, made one last desperate attempt to retaliate, launching everything it had in a futile effort to destroy the Vanguard. But Voss was already on the move. He had predicted this, had seen the way the Zorlath reacted to pressure. They were cornered, their tactics predictable. The Vanguard's final strike was swift. Another precision blast to the cruiser's core. The Zorlath ship erupted into flames, its structure disintegrating before it even had a chance to retaliate. The battle was over. The crew of the Vanguard let out a collective breath, the tension that had gripped them for what felt like an eternity finally dissipating. Ro's voice came over the comms, breathless but victorious. "We did it. We really did it." Voss stood silently for a moment, his gaze fixed on the debris of the destroyed fleet. The battle had been won, but this was just the beginning. The galaxy would know of the Warlord's return. Humanity's fight for survival had taken a critical step forward, and the tide of war had, for the first time in years, begun to turn in their favor. But there was still much left to do. He turned to face his crew, his voice firm once more. "We're not finished yet. This is only the beginning." And with that, the Vanguard sped off into the unknown, ready for whatever came next. The Vanguard limped through space, its hull battered, its systems straining under the weight of a hard-fought victory. The battle had left its mark on the ship and its crew. They had struck a blow against the Zorlath Empire, but it was a fleeting success. The remnant human forces were still fractured, scattered across the galaxy, and with every victory, the stakes grew higher. Voss could feel the burden of that weight in every step he took aboard the ship. He walked the narrow halls of the Vanguard, his boots echoing in the silence. The crew was working to patch up the ship, but the atmosphere was different now, less fearful, more determined. It wasn't just the thrill of victory that fueled them. It was the realization that they had a chance, one slim, fragile chance, to turn the tide of the war. For the first time in years, Voss saw something in the eyes of his crew that he hadn't seen in too long. Hope. But for Voss, the battle was far from won. He had been here before, too many times. He knew the cost of hope, the cost of war. "You're quiet," Rose's voice interrupted his thoughts. She was leaning against a bulkhead, arms crossed, her gaze sharp. "I thought winning a battle was supposed to make you smile." Voss didn't smile. Instead, he met her gaze, his expression hard. "The war's not over. We've taken one step, but there's still a long way to go. And we can't afford to let our guard down." Rose's lips tightened. "I know that, but you're still carrying something. I can see it. You've been carrying it since the betrayal." The name Zarek lingered in the air, unspoken but understood. The wound was still fresh, even if it had been buried beneath the years of silence and exile. Voss clenched his fists at his sides, his jaw tightening. "Zarek is not my focus right now. The Zorlath Empire is." Ro didn't argue. She understood. But there was something more that haunted Voss, something deeper than just the betrayal of a friend. The Zorlath were not just an external enemy. They were a reminder of the darkness that had always lurked within human ambition. Voss had seen it before, in the rise of empires, in the ambition of leaders who believed their power could change the galaxy. He had seen it in Zarek. "Any updates from the others?" Voss asked, changing the subject. Ro nodded. "Our recon teams report that the Zorlath are regrouping. They've lost some key ships, but they're not finished. They're consolidating their forces at a stronghold near the Outer Rim. We've also intercepted a communication suggesting that Zarek is personally overseeing the defense." Voss felt a cold chill slide down his spine. Zarek, his former comrade, now the enemy's right hand. The very thought of facing him again, after everything that had transpired, was almost unbearable. But he couldn't afford weakness. Not now, not when humanity's future hung by a thread. "We're going to need more than just our forces if we want to hit them hard," Voss said, his mind already working through the next steps. "We need allies." Ro raised an eyebrow. "Allies? We're talking about finding people to trust in the middle of a galactic war." "It's not about trust," Voss replied, his tone grim. "It's about necessity. The Zorlath are more than just a threat to us. They're a threat to everyone. We're not the only species they've subjugated. If we can unite the others, the Draken, the Pyrians, the Tyrians, then we can strike where it hurts. The Zorlath thrive on isolation, if we force them to fight on multiple fronts." Ro nodded slowly, her eyes calculating. "That's a long shot." Voss's lips curled into something resembling a smile. "The best shots always are." The Vanguard made its way toward the Outer Rim, where rumors of Zarek's stronghold had surfaced. They had no illusions about the difficulty of their mission. The Zorlath were entrenched, their forces bolstered by Zarek's cunning and ruthlessness. But Voss knew that in war, unpredictability was an ally. They would strike when the Zorlath least expected it, cutting off their reinforcements and forcing them into a corner. As the ship neared its destination, Voss gathered his crew. They had come a long way since their first battle together, but the hardest challenges were yet to come. "I won't lie to you," Voss said to the gathered crew. "This won't be easy. But if we succeed, we take the fight directly to the heart of the Zorleth Empire. We cripple their power and give the rest of the galaxy a fighting chance." He paused, his eyes sweeping over the faces of his team. "There's no going back after this. Once we're in, we fight until the end. And I promise you, Zarek will pay for what he's done." The crew exchanged looks. They knew the stakes, and they knew the risks. But there was no turning back now. They had fought for too long, blood too much, to stop. Voss's heart hardened as he looked ahead. The Zorleth Empire might have underestimated humanity once, but they wouldn't make that mistake again. He wasn't just fighting for revenge. He was fighting for the future. And this time, he would make sure humanity didn't just survive, but thrived. "Let's make sure the galaxy knows that the Warlord is back," he said, his voice low but filled with the kind of deadly confidence that only comes from knowing what's at stake. The Vanguard surged forward, its engines thrumming with renewed purpose. The battle for the galaxy had truly begun. The Vanguard cut through the silence of the void, its hull barely intact, but its purpose more defined than ever. They were heading into the heart of the Zorleth stronghold, a place where the very foundations of the Empire pulsed with power. As they neared the outskirts of Zarek's fortress, the crew felt the weight of their mission pressing down on them. They weren't just going into enemy territory. They were heading straight into the belly of the beast. "Shields are holding," Rose's voice crackled over the comms, but even she couldn't hide the tension in her tone. "But I don't think they'll last if we go any closer without a fight." Voss stood in the command center, his hands clasped behind his back, as he stared at the vast blackness of space ahead. The stars were obscured by the growing presence of Zorleth ships and stations, their dark silhouettes ominous against the backdrop of the cold expanse. The stronghold was a fortress of technology and firepower, Zarek's personal bastion, and it was more heavily guarded than anything Voss had encountered in his time as a commander. "We'll need to make a distraction," Voss said, his voice calm, despite the mounting danger. "Alia, can you get us through the defenses?" Ro didn't need to ask what he meant. "I've got a plan, but we're going to need to get in close. Real close." "Do it," Voss ordered. "We're in this together." The Vanguard's engines flared as they approached, cutting a direct path toward the outer perimeter of the stronghold. The enemy's sensors were on high alert, but Voss's team had a few tricks left up their sleeves. Rose's plan involved creating a series of fake signatures, decoys that would fool the Zorleth into thinking they were under attack from multiple directions. If they could just distract enough of the Zorleth fleet, the Vanguard could slip through undetected. The plan was risky, but Voss knew there was no other choice. The longer they waited, the more prepared the Zorleth would be. The element of surprise was their only advantage. Deploying decoys in 5, Rose's voice echoed through the command center. The tension was thick, but Voss could feel his crew's readiness, their focus sharpened in the face of the impossible. The Vanguard was now flying in close formation with the decoy drones, which scattered outward in all directions. The drones unleashed a barrage of fake energy signatures, mimicking the signature of multiple human ships, the kind that would suggest a full-scale invasion. Almost immediately, the Zorleth responded, diverting several of their ships to intercept the false threat. "Decoys are working," Ro confirmed. "They've bitten. We've got about 5 minutes before they realize it's a trap." Voss nodded. 5 minutes, a short window of time to infiltrate the heart of the fortress and strike directly at Zarek's stronghold. 5 minutes to turn the tide of the war in humanity's favor, or die trying. "Helm, take us in," Voss ordered. "Steady as she goes." The ship rocked as it passed through the defense perimeter, barely dodging a barrage of Zorleth laser fire from a nearby cruiser. It was close. Too close. The Vanguard was a sitting target, its defenses compromised. Yet they pressed on, past the barrage of enemy fire, toward the core of Zarek's fortress. Ro was already scanning ahead. "We're going to need to disable their primary weapons array," she said, eyes flicking to the readout. "If we can get to their central control center, we can launch a localized EMP pulse. That'll take down the whole station's defenses." "Do it," Voss said. His voice was low and steady, betraying none of the anxiety that churned beneath his calm exterior. They had one shot, and it had to be perfect. Any mistake now would mean certain death. The Vanguard adjusted course, angling toward a narrow gap between two enormous Zorlath warships. The gap was barely wide enough for the ship to pass through, and the Zorlath were already responding. Enemy fire streaked through space, sizzling against the Vanguard's hull, but the ship held fast, its engines roaring as it pushed forward. "EMP pulse ready," Ro said. "On your mark." Voss gritted his teeth. They were almost there, almost at the heart of Zarek's fortress, the place where everything would either fall apart or come together. The central control center loomed ahead, surrounded by a field of Zorlath ships. Voss took a deep breath. His mind was clear, focused. There was no more room for second thoughts. His destiny had led him here, and this was the moment to fulfill it. "Now," Voss commanded. Ro initiated the EMP pulse, and a massive shockwave rippled outward from the Vanguard, enveloping the control center in a powerful field of electromagnetic disruption. The Zorlath ships surrounding the fortress staggered as their systems began to shut down, their weapons going offline, their sensors blinking out. The Vanguard didn't hesitate. It surged forward, tearing through the now vulnerable defenses like a predator closing in on its prey. "We're in," Voss muttered under his breath. His fingers tightened around the console, the weight of what came next settling on him. Zarek was within reach. The final confrontation was about to begin. The Vanguard shuddered as it entered the central courtyard of the Zorlath stronghold, its EMP pulse still rippling through the wreckage of the Zorlath's defenses. The once impenetrable fortress was now a maze of flickering lights, dormant weapons systems, and disabled ships. It was a ghost town, but Voss knew better than to think they had won. This was just the calm before the storm. "Stay sharp," Voss said, his voice low but commanding as he turned toward his crew. "Zarek will be waiting for us." Ro's expression was unreadable as she worked her controls. "We're inside. No sign of Zarek's ship yet, but I'm getting readings from the central control room. It's heavily fortified." "Then we'll make our own way in," Voss replied, his voice steely. His eyes flashed with the fire of a warrior who had seen too much loss, too many betrayals. Today, Zarek would pay for everything. The Vanguard docked inside the heart of the fortress, and Voss led the way as his team suited up for what was to come. The air inside the station felt cold, sterile, with an almost oppressive silence hanging over them. It was the kind of silence that spoke of impending doom, the kind that often comes before a final confrontation. "We don't know how many Zorlath are here, but we can't afford to waste time," Voss said, leading the way down the metal corridors. His heart beat steadily, his senses heightened. Every footstep echoed in the tight hallways, each corner hiding potential dangers. His grip tightened around the hilt of his pulse pistol. They moved quickly, past rows of dormant Zorlath soldiers, unconscious or disabled by the EMP pulse. The corridors grew darker as they approached the central control room. Voss could feel his breath catching in his chest, his pulse quickening. This was it. Zarek was here. He had to be. "I've got the layout of the control room," Ro's voice came through his earpiece. "It's just up ahead. We'll have to breach the door. And I don't think we'll be alone when we do." No sooner had Ro spoken than the sound of distant footsteps reverberated down the hall, followed by the unmistakable hum of Zorlath weapons powering up. They were coming, and Zarek had clearly anticipated their arrival. Voss's mind raced. "Prepare for an ambush," he barked. "Take cover." The team ducked behind a series of crates and walls as Zorlath soldiers appeared, their angular armor glinting in the dim light. They had no intention of letting the humans through without a fight. A brief firefight ensued, with Ro's squadron expertly picking off Zorlav as they advanced. The Vanguard's crew was well-trained, their tactics fluid and efficient. But the Zorlav weren't without their own strategy. They'd been preparing for this moment, too, and more reinforcements soon flooded into the corridor. "Voss, the door's locked down," Ro shouted over the comms. "We need to get it open, or we'll be sitting ducks." Voss didn't hesitate. His hands moved with precision, hacking into the control panel on the wall and overriding the security systems. The door was massive, but Voss was relentless, his mind sharp as a blade. The seconds felt like hours as the pressure mounted. But then, click. The door slid open with a hiss, revealing the control room beyond. The space was vast, filled with the hum of alien technology and the faint pulse of lights that flickered ominously. And there, standing in the center of the room, was Zarek. His once pristine Zorlav armor was battered, scared, just like the man himself. His sharp, calculating eyes locked onto Voss, and for a moment, time seemed to stretch. There was no need for words. The hatred between them was palpable, years of betrayal and war hanging thick in the air. "Voss," Zarek's voice was cold, devoid of emotion. "You should have stayed gone." "I should have," Voss replied, his voice a low growl. "But you didn't leave me any choice, did you?" Without warning, Zarek lunged, a blinding flash of motion. His weapon crackled to life, and the room erupted into chaos as Voss and his crew dove for cover. Blasts of energy scorched the air, narrowly missing as the two combatants faced off across the room. Zarek was fast, unpredictable, his every move calculated. But Voss was faster, his combat instincts honed through years of war. He darted between pillars of alien metal, his mind racing with each maneuver. This was no longer just a battle for survival, it was personal. "I don't need to defeat you, Zarek," Voss shouted over the noise, his eyes narrowing. "I just need to make sure you don't get out of here alive." The fight continued, each moment a battle of wits and reflexes. Zarek's strikes were precise, but Voss was relentless. The two men danced a deadly tango, their weapons crackling with energy. But the longer the fight wore on, the more the balance of power shifted. Voss's fury, his determination, had taken hold of him. He wasn't just fighting for survival now. He was fighting for the future of humanity. With a final, brutal move, Voss disarmed Zarek, sending his weapon clattering to the floor. Before the former comrade could react, Voss struck, a brutal blow to his chest that sent Zarek to the ground, blood spilling across the metal floor. "Goodbye, Zarek," Voss said, his voice heavy with finality. Zarek's eyes flickered with something between fury and resignation as he gasped for breath. But the light in his eyes dimmed, and with one last rasping breath, he fell silent. The Warlord was no more. Voss stood over the body, his heart pounding with the aftermath of the battle. The control room hummed with the flickering lights, now a testament to the fall of Zarek and the beginning of a new era. "We've won," Ro said softly, the relief in her voice unmistakable. Voss nodded, his gaze sweeping over the control room. "We've won. But the war is far from over. We still have a galaxy to save." And with that, humanity's fight for the stars continued, stronger, wiser, and more united than ever before. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in years, hope was within reach.